Hi, this is Jeff Blowett, technical agronomist for Cooperative Farmers Elevator, and back from vacation, had a week off from our Field Friday segments, but back at it this week. Here we are, we're basically in mid-July here. I thought we'd talk about the tail end of our herbicide season for the soybeans. With this finally calm and hot weather here and finally dried out enough where we're probably hopefully finishing up spring. We've been seeing a lot of fields turning brown lately, and I think you're going to see a whole bunch more come early next week because we're hopefully finishing up. But if we haven't got it finished up, I just wanted to point out a couple things that are, getting to the point where our window is closing really rapidly, and it needs to on these soybean herbicides. We see a lot of these beans turning brown. That's basically from what we call mode of action wise a group 14 cell membrane disruptors. That's why these beans look brown. We're basically trying to disrupt a lot of cell membranes, and it basically bleeds all the cell contents out, and it's kind of like it scabs over, you might say. If we have a wound or something, the beans are doing the same thing. We've got a couple pictures here of a field that was just sprayed within the last 2 days. You can see what it's doing to the soybeans. There is some really burnt brown leaves. That's what you see from the road, the drive-by. But you can also see what we're doing to the water hemp here. Soybeans are much more tolerant than some weeds. Luckily, water hemp, if it's not resistant to these classes of chemistry, they are really good at taking that herbicide in and melting it down. This is probably bigger than we'd like to see sprayed. We did a good job here the way it looks. But I wouldn't expect that consistently of that size. But that's kind of what that looks like just right shortly after application when we have really good uptake. You can see by those cell membrane disruptor type properties that we need really good coverage to do a good job of taking those weeds out. That's why we're going back to those old flat fan style of nozzles, the ones that we went away from because they have more fine driftable particles. But as we move back to those contact type herbicides, we need as much coverage on the leaf surface as we can to do a good job. We're trying to cover all the growing points on these weeds. That's why it's important to get them small, because they have less growing points to cover. But when we have those types of herbicides, generally off-target movement, because we have more driftable fines, is not as big a deal either. Remember, we need good coverage to kill stuff. If we have some small drift, it generally isn't as big a deal, at least from the Cobra side of things. Or maybe it's avalanche or even Flexstar, which we should be done with by now. But those are some of the things that we have to deal with, and water hemp's, kind of evolved around some of our control mechanisms. We obviously have Roundup resistant water hemp. We're also starting to see some of these, what we want to call cell membrane disruptors. We're seeing some water hemp populations start to generate resistance to those too. That's very alarming, because that's one of our final tools prior to the herbicide tolerant crops that are coming, or we have already. But keep that in mind, as we need to manage these as best we can so we don't further that resistance as well. This is a field here that's been sprayed a few weeks back, or at least, I don't know, maybe at least a week, the way it looks to me. If you look at some of these plants, here's a couple plants that you can see that there is some burnt leaves here, but the field has a little bit more of an overall green look to it now again. You don't see the brown as much. It's those new trifoliates, and here's a picture of a close-up of a bean plant where you can see the new trifoliate has grown out since it's been sprayed. That plant did get set back a little bit, probably delayed it, but once it's recovered, it's growing fine. The effects are basically gone, but that's kind of what we're up against and what we have to do with some of these water hemp fields. We're here in the middle of July. A lot of these herbicides, we're going to run into restrictions on either pre-harvest intervals on the label or growth stage of the soybeans. Liberty beans, for instance, they're labeled up to R1. R1 in soybeans is when you see a flower on the bean. Some of the earliest planted beans are starting to show a little bit of a flower to it now. So we're getting really rapidly close, especially if we get some warm weather where these things really grow, to starting to be at the end of our Liberty window, and hopefully we've got all that applied. The Cobras, the Avalanches, those types of products, they're somewhere in that 45 to 60 day pre-harvest interval. So if we think 60 days, we've got 2 months well, we're here mid-July, that's mid-August, mid-September. We're going to probably be starting to get close to when we're going to start combining some of these beans on faster ground or whatever, so we want to be cognizant of that, because that's going to be coming here really rapidly too, especially as we get into maybe potentially looking at resprays if we didn't have something work well. The Enlist technology, the 2,4-D tolerance, there's not a lot of acres of that out there. They are labeled to R2, so we have a little bit of time with that yet, although I'm a little nervous spraying 2,4-D in hot and warm conditions here as we get into mid and late July, just from a risk perspective, but that is the label on those. And then the Extend technology, the dicamba or the old Banville tolerance that we've been working with, that's labeled, the label's evolved here the last few years, 45 days after planting. So if we rewind 45 days from where we are today, we probably are starting to run into where there's not many beans that were planted within this 45-day window. And again, we're spraying these in July in some hot and humid conditions where off-target movement or volatilization could still be a risk. So be aware of those things. There's some other options for various things. We've got some volunteer corn escapes and so on. Just visit with your CFE agronomist on some of these situations that arise and see what we can do and try and stay as close to the label as we can. And hopefully we can, basically be wrapping up and keep everything happy here and growing forward. But just thought I'd touch on some of those late season soybean situations from a herbicide perspective, and hopefully we're going to have clean fields this fall, but I know we've got a lot of situations out there that are kind of out of our control. So with that, that's this week's Field Friday segment, and we'll see you next week.